Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to be reviewing the solutions to the homework for Unit 5, Lesson 3, using inverse operations to solve quadratics. Let's take a look. Remember to pause or rewind the video as needed. In number 1, letter A, we have 2x squared equals 98. So to solve for x, we need to get rid of the 2 and the squared. Well, we'll start by dividing both sides by 2. And when we do that, if you rewrite this, we get x squared equals 49. The opposite of a square, the inverse of a square, is the square root. So let's square root both sides. Remember, when you take the square root, you take the plus or minus root. And so we get x is equal to plus or minus 7. Letter B. Now, if the x has a term that's trapped in a grouping symbol, well, let's eliminate the grouping symbol first. The grouping symbol would be the parenthesis with the squared. So let's get rid of the parenthesis and the squared first. We're going to start this one by square rooting both sides. When we rewrite this thing, the x minus 3 pops out, or x plus 3, excuse me, pops out, and that is equal to plus or minus 5. The square root of 25 is 5. Now, what I would do at this point is I would actually rewrite this as two separate equations. So x plus 3 equals 5, and x plus 3 equals negative 5. X equals 2, and x equals negative 8. Letter C. X squared minus 11 equals 53. Well, the first thing we probably ought to do is get rid of the 11, and let's add that to both sides. When we do, we get x squared equals 64. Take the square root of both sides to get rid of the square, and we get x is equal to plus or minus 8. Letter D. Well, in order to get x by itself, we have to get rid of the 3, the 4, and the squared. Let's start with the 3. To get rid of the 3, you're going to start by multiplying both sides by 3, and then rewrite the equation. This becomes x minus 4 quantity squared equals 3 times 12, or 36. I'm going to write that again. This time, my next step is I'm going to square root both sides. Plus or minus. X minus 4 equals 6, and x minus 4 equals negative 6. Remember, plus or minus. Add 4 to both sides. And x equals 10. And x equals negative 2. Letter E. Well, in order to get x by itself, I need to get rid of the 20, the 1, and the squared. Let's start with the 20. Now, at first, this seems kind of hard because, well, we have a reduced fraction. Well, x plus 1 quantity squared equals 5 over 20. Now, if I reduce that, 5 goes into 5 one time, and 5 goes into 20 4 times. So 5 over 20 reduces to 1 over 4. Now I'm going to take the square root of both sides, plus or minus. And when I do that, I get x plus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 1/4. Now the square root of 1/4 would be 1/2 because you have to square the square root of the 1 and square root of the 4 separately. And lastly, I'm going to go ahead and subtract 1 from both sides. So we get two possible answers here. X is equal to -1 plus 1/2. Well, -1 plus 1/2 would be -1/2, or -0.5 if you prefer to write it as a decimal. And x is equal to -1 minus 1/2, which would be -1 and 1/2, or -3/2. Both answers are fine. I'm going to typically write it as an improper fraction, but both answers are acceptable. Now, with f, okay, there's a series of steps we want to be able to do with f. And first thing we're going to probably want to do is get rid of the 5. So let's go ahead and subtract that from both sides. And we get -2 times the quantity x minus 7 squared equals, when we add that together, it's -200. Go ahead and divide out the -2, cancels, and it's turned everything positive. X minus 7 squared, quantity x minus 7 squared, equals 100. Now take the square root of both sides. X minus 7 equals plus or minus 10. And there we have our two possible answers. X plus 7 equals 10. X plus 7 equals -10. I keep saying plus, x minus 7. So we're going to add 7 to both sides in both equations. And we get x equals 17. And we get x equals -3. Okay, in this one, we're going to go add 6 to both sides. And so we get the quantity of 2x plus 1 squared equals 25 when you add those two together. We're going to square root both sides. In which case we get 2x plus 1, because that's what pops out, equals plus or minus 5. So our two equations would be 2x plus 1 equals 5, and 2x plus 1 equals -5. Solve each one for x. Start by subtracting 1. 2x equals 4. Divide by 2. X equals 2. In the second part of the equation, again, subtract 1. 2x equals -6. X equals -3. Number 2, which of the following is the solution set to the equation quantity x minus 6 squared divided by 2 plus 4 equals 36? Let's take a look. First thing we want to do is probably get rid of that 4. So we'll begin by subtracting 4 both sides, rewrite the equation. Quantity x minus 6 squared divided by 2 equals 32. Then we'll go ahead and get rid of the 2 by multiplying both sides by 2. Again, rewrite. And we get the quantity of x minus 6 squared equals 64. Then we'll go ahead and get rid of the square root by square rooting both sides. We'll get rid of the square, by square rooting both sides. Remember, plus or minus root. And x minus 6 equals plus or minus 8. Last step. X minus 6 equals 8. And x minus 6 equals negative 8. Solve each one. Add 6. Add 6. X equals 14. X equals negative 2. So our only solution set would be 2 and negative 2 and 14. Number 3, solve each of the following quadratics by using inverse operations. Express your answers in simplest radical form. Let's begin. Letter A. Let us start this problem by adding 4 to both sides and rewriting the equation. 1/2 x squared equals 4. Then we will go ahead and multiply 2 both sides and rewrite the equation. X squared equals 8. Then we will take the square root of both sides. X squared equals plus or minus the square root of 8. Now, if you remember our work with simplifying the simplest radical form, you need to list your perfect square roots. 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, and 100. Now, the largest perfect square that divides into 8 would be 4. So what we're going to do is we're going to rewrite this as x squared equals plus or minus the square root of 4 times 2, which would be, sorry, not x squared, x. X equals plus or minus the square root of 4 times the square root of 2, which is x is equal to plus or minus 2 radical 2. Letter B, we're going to begin by square rooting both sides. And we get x minus 5 equals the square root of 18. Now, the largest perfect square that divides into 18 would be 9. So we would change this into x minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 9 times 2, which would be x minus 5 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 9 times the square root of 2. X minus 5 equals plus or minus, take the square root of 9, and that would be 3 radical 2. And then last step, let's go ahead and add the 5 over here. And we get x is equal to 5 plus or minus 3 radical 2. Letter C. Let's go ahead and begin by subtracting 7 both sides. And when we rewrite this, we get 2x squared equals 64. Divide 2 both sides. We get x squared equals 32. Square root both sides. Now the largest perfect square that goes into 32 would be 16. So we get x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 16 times 2, which is x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 16 times the square root of 2, which x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 4, radical 2. Letter D. We'll begin letter D by subtracting 37 from both sides. And when we do, we get 5 times x plus 2 squared equals 450 when we subtract that. Then we'll go ahead and divide by 5 both sides, rewrite. And we get the quantity of x plus 2 squared equals, well, 45 divided by 5 is 9, so 450 divided by 5 is 90. I'm going to copy that again down here. X plus 2 quantity squared equals 90. Now I'm going to square root both sides to equals plus or minus the square root of 90. The largest perfect square root that divides into 90 would be 9. So I would rewrite this as x plus 2 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 9 times 10. X plus 2 is equal to the plus or minus of the square root of 9 times the square root of 10. X plus 2 is equal to plus or minus, take the square root of 9, and it's 3 radical 10. And then last step, you're going to go ahead and subtract 2 both sides. So x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus 3 radical 10. Letter E, quantity x minus 4 squared divided by 3 plus 8 equals 17. First thing we'll do, let's get rid of the 8 and rewrite. This becomes x minus 4 quantity squared divided by 3 equals 9. We will then go ahead and multiply by 3 to get rid of the 1/3 there. And this becomes x minus 4 quantity squared equals 27. Take the square root of both sides. X minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of the largest perfect square that goes into 27 would be 9. So this is 9 times 3. X minus 4 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 9 times the square root of 3, which when we take the square root of 3, get x minus 4 is equal to plus or minus 3 radical 3. Last step, add 4 to both sides, and x is equal to 4 plus or minus 3 radical 3. Number 4. The height h of an object above the ground in feet can be modeled as a function of time t in seconds using the equation h of t equals negative 16 times the quantity t minus 2 squared plus 400 for all t greater than or equal to 0. This last term here just simply means time can only be 0 or positive. You can't have negative time. Well, if you were to draw a picture of what's going on here, you essentially have an object, which I'm going to drop as a ball, and it's falling from a height that at time equals 0. When you put time equals 0 right in here, in other words, when the ball's dropped, at time equals 0, 0 minus 2 is negative 2. Negative 2 squared is 4. 4 times negative 16 is negative 64, and negative 64 plus 400 is 336. So what that basically means is the ball is dropped initially from a height of 336 feet above the ground. At some time later, which you're trying to find, the height is 0. The ground is 0. So what you're going to do is you're going to essentially write down this function, negative 16 times t minus 2 squared plus 400, but you're going to set that equal to h equals 0. And we'll solve for time. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by adding or subtracting, 400 from both sides. And then as I do that, I'm going to go ahead and reverse the order of this equation because I prefer to have my variables on the left-hand side. So we have negative 16 times t minus 2 quantity squared is equal to negative 400. Then we'll go ahead and divide both sides by negative 16. And we get t minus 2 quantity squared is equal to 25. Take the square root of both sides. And t minus 2 is equal to 5. And t minus 2 is equal to negative 5. Remember, you have two answers, plus or minus. Well, add 2 to both sides. Here we get t is equal to 7 seconds. Here we get t is equal to negative 3 seconds. Since time cannot be negative, we disregard that answer. For part B, find all the times when the object is at a height of 200 feet. Well, what this simply means is let h equal 200 and then solve. So if our equation is negative 16 times t minus 2 squared plus 400 equals h, I'm just reversing the order of the equation here. I'm going to replace h with 200. So let's try it. Negative 16 times quantity t minus 2 squared plus 400 equals 200. I'm going to start off exactly the same way. I'm going to subtract 200 both sides. Subtract 400 both sides. And I get negative 16 times the quantity t minus 2 squared equals negative 200. Now, I'm going to divide both sides by negative 16. And when I do that, I get t minus 2 quantity squared equals 12.5. We'll go ahead and plus or minus the square root of both sides. T minus 2 equals plus or minus, and I'm going to take the root of 12.5. So 12.5, the square root of 12.5, the approximation of the square root of 12.5 is about 3.5. I'm going to round it to the nearest tenth. And so our answers become t minus 2 is equal to 3.5, or t minus 2 equals negative 3.5. Solve each one. Plus 2, plus 2. T is equal to 5.5 because this is really plus 2.0. So 3.5 plus 2 would be 5.5 seconds. And here this adds up to negative. And time cannot be negative, so we reject that answer. And number 5, which of the following choices represents zeros of a function g of x equals 2 times the quantity of x minus 5 squared minus 500? Minus 400, rather. Well, remember, zeros of the function. Zeros mean set y equal to 0 and solve for x. So that's exactly what we're going to do. 2 times the quantity of x minus 5 squared minus 400 equals 0. Let's add 400 to both sides. Rewrite it. 2 times the quantity x minus 5 squared equals 400. Let's go ahead and divide 2 both sides. And we get the quantity of x minus 5 squared equals 200. Go ahead and square root both sides. Okay, and we end up with x minus 5 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 200. Now, the largest perfect square that divides into 200 would be 100. So this is the same as 100 times 2, which would be the same as x minus 5 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 100 times the square root of 2. But then, ladies and gentlemen, take the square root of 100, and we get x minus 5 is equal to plus or minus 10 radical 2. Last step, add 5 to both sides, and you get 2 possible answers. You get x is equal to 5 plus 10 radical 2 or minus 10 radical 2. Which would be number 1.